Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest edition of the Edinburgh Fortean Society online. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Gordon Rutter and I'm the organiser of these talks. Normally we meet on the second Tuesday of every month in a physical premises, usually a pub, and we have talks of a Fortean nature of interest to hopefully everyone who attends. Obviously, in current situation, we're not able to do that, but as soon as circumstances allow, we will be going back to real life meetings, and you can find details about all of those in the various ways of interacting with the society that are written underneath the video here in the description. So we've got a Facebook page, we've got a website, we've got a Twitter account, we're on Meetup, etc., etc. So all of the information will be there. So tonight we're continuing with our attempt at using the pandemic to the best of our opportunity, because there are a number of speakers who, for geographical and financial reasons, we wouldn't necessarily be able to get to come and speak to us. So recently we've had Sharon Hill speaking from the States, and for tonight's speaker we've got a lifelong Fortean who's a writer of several books, and we'll mention those, and he has a wide range of interests in the Fortean side of things, and I'm sure he's going to be giving us an absolutely fascinating talk tonight. So, direct from New York, ladies and gentlemen, Robert Schneck.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here.
We're absolutely delighted to have you, Robert. As I say, under normal circumstances, because you live in New York, we couldn't really get you to come across for the price of your bus fare and what have you. So, we're very grateful for you to give your time tonight to give us this talk. And, perhaps if our numbers come up on the lottery, we'll be able to get you over in real life. That would be absolutely excellent. But, we've not had much success on the lottery so far, so don't hold your breath on that.
Till then.
Yep, cool. So, you are the author of two very, very highly regarded Fortean books, Mrs. Wakeman and the Antichrist and The President's Vampire. And some of the people tonight will be familiar with at least one aspect of The President's Vampire. You know exactly what I'm talking about, and it really is the elephant in the room, so we can't not mention it. The Bye-Bye Man. Tell us more.
Well, the Bye-Bye Man was a blind albino psychic serial killer that a friend of mine and his girlfriend and another friend supposedly contacted with a Ouija board. And they ended up having a few strange experiences, certainly experiences that frightened them. And my friend used to tell this story every Halloween, and he admitted that every year he would embroider it. I'm wrong. Not Halloween. He would tell it on Devil's Night, the night before Halloween. That's when he would have his annual Devil's Night party. And he would tell the story, and like I said, he would admit that every year he embroidered it, every year he tried to tell it in as exciting a way as possible. But I was always fascinated by it because the first time I heard it, it genuinely frightened me. And I have heard a lot of stories, and very few of them frightened me. But this one stayed with me. In fact, the next morning, I remember lying in bed and looking at the light under the door, which plays a part in the story, and getting nervous. So again, it did stay with me. Anyway, I used to tell the story on the radio in the United States all the time, and eventually a filmmaker heard me tell the story, and I told it as dramatically as possible, although I stuck to the facts as much as I could. My friend and I worked on shaving away the things he had added and trying to get back to the actual basic story. And as I said, someone heard me tell it, and they called me. It was a filmmaker. He was actually well known for making. His name was Pryor, and he made films like Killer Workout, which was a slasher film in a gym, and actually he made an excellent series. He did an excellent documentary on the Zodiac Killer, but no, that's something else. Anyway, over a period of 10 years, after about 10 years of negotiating, at one point Harvey Weinstein was involved. Um, it finally was released as The Bye Bye Man. And it was, I mean, I will say that going to see it in the movies was an experience, and it was very exciting. Uh, and I've never regretted it, but I'm actually more interested in historical oddities and not just not typically Fortean. I also spend a lot of time looking at bizarre crime. In fact, I have often said that for me the perfect story is one that's got a paranormal element, a murder in it, some madness, and maybe one or two other little elements and that definitely will get me interested. I specialize in cases from the United States, mainly because it's just so much easier to do the research.
And I know you do an incredible amount of research.
Oh, that I do.
I see your postings on Facebook and all this sort of thing, and you know the snippets that you come up with that are not necessarily the main part of your research, but you know just things that you find as you're doing it, and you post online because you've got your Historian of the Strange account on Facebook, which I could recommend.
Yes,
Yeah, so
yeah. That actually, I have that historian of the strange page is that works for me on several levels. First of all, I'm able to share every odd thing I find that doesn't necessarily have enough material to justify a story, but it's still so interesting. I want to share it. And I've also found a lot of stories that I'm writing about now while looking for things to post. So it's really worked out very well.
excellent. Are you researching a specific book at the moment, or just doing general stuff? Obviously, you may
Well,
not be able to speak about it, but
no, no,
if you
no,
can.
no. I can talk about it. It's since people seem to really like the collections. I've been just working slowly towards writing a third book that would be a collection of oddities and strange but true. I tend to use strange but true rather than Fortean because then I don't have to explain what Fortean is.
Good. Yeah, yeah. I feel your pain there.
Uh-huh.
And talking of strange but true, that's what you're going to be talking on tonight,
Yes.
with a talk entitled Otherwise Inexplicable. So, I think the sensible thing is for me to hand over to you and Otherwise Inexplicable. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you. The death of Albert R. Rudisill in 1932 was described by Charlotte, North Carolina's chief of detectives as the most freakish case I have ever worked. Rudisill was a 24-year-old shipping clerk found hanging from the beam of the warehouse that employed him. But it was not a rope around his neck. It was a woman's cloak that had been twisted into a rope. Furthermore, he wore a black dress with a leather belt fastened around his middle. He had lipstick and rouge on his face, earrings, and the heavy rubber goggles that are used when handling acids. Inside the goggles were a pair of lenses from pince-nez glasses. Rudisill wore his usual shoes while the rest of his clothing was inside a locker used for hanging coats. Now, he was a respectable man with a job and a family who neither drank nor had questionable companions, so what happened to him? He almost certainly died accidentally while engaged in autoerotic asphyxia. Widespread knowledge of autoerotic asphyxia and its sometimes fatal consequences, however, is a recent development. The connection between sex and strangulation is not. Pick the first slide. There is the traditional beliefs that men ejaculate when they are hanged. This is still widely believed, but it's almost certainly just the release of some urine, although they do sometimes seem to get erections, but they don't ejaculate. Slightly off topic, this actually ties in a little bit with Dr. Neil Cream. Some people say that when he was about to be hanged, he said, "I am Jack," and that's how he got connected to Jack the Ripper. But some people think he was about to say, "I'm ejaculating." Anyway, that's everything goes back to Jack the Ripper, I suppose. Anyway, the idea with the mandrake is that the semen of hanged men grows into the mandrake plant, which of course has uses in black magic, medicine, and all kinds of other uses. Um, Now, next slide, please. There are other references to erotic strangling which appear in literature, but probably the most notorious case before the modern era is from 1791, and it involved the Czech musician and composer František Kocvara. Kocvara is famous for writing a piece called The Battle of Prague, which you can find on YouTube. I would actually be using it as background music here if I knew how. But he was an unusual man. He hired a prostitute named Susanna Hill, who was about 21 years old, and this was in London. He hired a prostitute named Hill, and apparently his first request was for her to cut off his genitals, but she wasn't about to do that. So he then asked her to hang him for 5 minutes and then cut him down. He used hanging as a remedy for impotence, but by the time she cut Kocvara down, he was dead. Now, this put her in a difficult situation. I think she was originally brought up on charges of murder, which were reduced to accidental manslaughter. But the judge, I believe she was convicted of accidental manslaughter, and the judge released her immediately because he just felt she had no real guilt in this. But her story was told in a pamphlet titled Modern Propensities, an essay on the art of strangling. And supposedly, this was responsible for widespread use of hanging as a remedy for impotence in the 19th century. I've read that there were hanged men's clubs and stories, other stories of men being hanged to overcome impotence. I don't know how much of that is true, but certainly you will find many references to it. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, sexual asphyxia naturally appears in the works of the Marquis de Sade and William S. Burroughs. I haven't read William S. Burroughs, but from what I understand, there are many, many references to it in his books. And when you go through the old medical journals, you will occasionally find a reference to what sounds like a case of autoerotic asphyxiation. It was during the 1970s, however, that the subject began creeping out of the margins and towards general knowledge. Could I have the next slide, please? By 1980, various experts, including Dr. Park Dietz and Roy Hazelwood, who are best known for helping develop criminal profiling for the FBI, they published a book devoted to the subject called Autoerotic Fatalities, which, if you can find a copy, I highly recommend. It's fascinating. The year after that, an article appeared in the August 1981 issue of Hustler magazine titled Orgasm of Death. And this article supposedly inspired a 14-year-old boy to hang himself and led to the publisher being unsuccessfully sued. The impact of books and skin magazines, however, can't compare to the impact of dead celebrities. Next slide, please. The first notable modern case was Stephen Milligan, a British politician best remembered for how he died. In 1994, the Conservative MP for Eastleigh was found in his London home, hanging from an electric cord that was knotted into a noose. He was naked except for women's stockings and suspenders. He had a black plastic bag over his head and a slice of mandarin orange in his mouth. There was no evidence of a crime, so it was decided that Milligan had a fatal accident during autoerotic asphyxia, and the manner of his death actually went on to be an embarrassment for the government of John Major, which was dealing with a lot of scandals at the time. This just added to Major's problems. The next slide is of Michael Hutchence. Michael Hutchence was the frontman and singer for the band INXS, and he died in 1997. Now, Hutchence was staying at a hotel in Sydney where he attached one end of a snakeskin belt to the automatic closing hinge on the door to his room. He looped the other end around his neck and strangled to death. Now, they looked into his background, and he was having personal problems. He was taking drugs and drinking alcohol, and it led to an official finding of suicide. But he is popularly believed to have died during autoerotic asphyxia, and the fact that he was naked and there was no note are consistent with that interpretation. Moreover, one of Hutchence's former lovers said that he enjoyed being strangled. Next slide, please. The third and probably most famous case of autoerotic asphyxiation is David Carradine. In 2009, the 72-year-old actor was in Thailand shooting a film and staying in a hotel in Bangkok where his body was discovered inside the room's closet. 2 cords were tied around his neck. He had been asphyxiated to the cord that was connected to the closet rod, while the other end of the cord is tied to his genitals. Some reports also claim that he was wearing a woman's wig and fishnet stockings, but I don't know if that's true. Carradine's death was initially described as suicide, but 2 autopsies declared it was a misadventure during autoerotic asphyxia. Also, like Hutchence, one of Carradine's ex-wives said that he had a predilection for being choked to the point of orgasm. Now, that was 11 years ago. Autoerotic asphyxia is now familiar enough to be a punchline or a story element in a sitcom. Next slide, please. And here we see it was the basis for a story in Family Guy. It's also appeared in South Park and a few other programs. And while autoerotic asphyxiation might have been almost unknown to the general public before the 1980s, judging by the contents of old newspapers, individuals have always discovered and practiced autoerotic asphyxia on their own. Could I have the next slide? This is just a collection, a small collection of some of the stories that I found. If you look at the headlines, you'll see that just a quick glance shows that these certainly sound like cases of autoerotic asphyxiation. But as I said, individuals have always discovered and practiced it on their own. And since autoerotic asphyxia is dangerous, the fatalities will inevitably follow, and that brings us to the subject of the talk. The title, Otherwise Inexplicable, refers to how autoerotic asphyxiation deaths make no sense when autoerotic asphyxiation is unknown. And it considers the question, How were they explained when people did not know that autoerotic asphyxia existed? So, imagine that it's 1932. You have a copy of the Charlotte Observer newspaper, and you just read about Albert Rudisell's death, the man I mentioned at the beginning. How would you explain it? It was a problem that laymen and professionals wrestled with every time a bizarre autoerotic asphyxiation death occurred. Now, before looking at examples, let's consider some points. Next slide, please. First, autoerotic asphyxia is a solitary act. This picture is interesting. It actually reminds me of those medieval pictures of wound man, but instead of a variety of wounds, this shows all the different ways that a person can be asphyxiated, many of which, almost all of which, are used in autoerotic asphyxia. The act itself involves the deliberate restriction of oxygen to the brain for the purpose of sexual arousal. The lack of oxygen leads to hypoxia. That's experienced as giddiness, lightheadedness, or euphoria during which the man, it's almost always a man, masturbates. Not always, but that seems to be the basic idea. The condition is, when you're in a state of hypoxia, it's believed to enhance or intensify the orgasm. Now, the way that the amount of air to the brain is reduced is done by compressing the carotid arteries. This is often done by using a ligature or putting a bag over the head, inhaling volatile chemicals, or some combination of methods. Now, inducing hypoxia does cause brain damage. So even if the person doesn't die of something else, it will cause brain damage over time. But again, just doing any of these things is potentially fatal, and it can cause both either asphyxiation or heart failure or both. Now, I don't know where they get this number, but they estimate that between 500 and 1,000 deaths occur due to autoerotic asphyxiation in the United States every year. Now, most of the cases discussed here are old, and there is no proof that they are autoerotic asphyxiation fatalities. But they so closely resemble known examples that I'm going to proceed on the assumption that they are, and I think it's a reasonable assumption. All right. Secondly, a second point rather, is all of the cases presented here involve men. Could I have the next slide, please? The typical autoerotic asphyxia fatality is a man in his early 30s. The small number of female deaths suggests that either comparatively few women practice autoerotic asphyxia, or they prefer its less dangerous forms, or they prefer forms that are more likely to be interpreted as suicide. There are cases of women dying of autoerotic asphyxiation, but they are rare. In fact, they're so rare that when they occur, you will almost always find a journal article about it because it is not something that happens very often. And they don't tend to involve some of the more bizarre things you'll see when men are practicing this. There are exceptions, of course, some big exceptions, but just as a general rule, that seems to hold. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, the third point is that the cases involving other fetishes are probably overrepresented in this sample. And the reason for that is simple. If Uncle Edgar hangs himself in the attic, it's sad. If Uncle Edgar hangs himself in the attic wearing Aunt Margaret's chemise, pearl earrings, and red high-heeled pumps, it's newsworthy. Both deaths might be the result of autoerotic asphyxiation, but the one involving cross-dressing will receive more coverage and increase the chances that someone like me will find it 100 years later. Can I have the next slide, please? Fourth, and finally, most of the solutions invented to explain autoerotic asphyxiation deaths fall into one of three categories. suicide, murder, or accidental death. Now, certainly when a man is found asphyxiated and there is nothing to suggest that he was killed deliberately or an accident occurred, then suicide seems logical. Logic, however, is not much help when it comes to the death of someone like Vernal Julian Fry. Next slide, please. Now, this is Vernal Julian Fry, the one being pointed to with the red arrow. In 1946, he was 40 years old and teaching science at the Redondo Union High School in Redondo Beach, California. He was well liked. His hobby was photography, so he installed a darkroom in his garage. And when he did not go to bed on the morning of December 4th, his wife found his body there in the darkroom. Fry was naked with, quote, a heavy rope around his neck and surrounded by pictures depicting tortures similar to the one that apparently caused his death. The rope circling his neck was tied to hooks on opposite walls, and he was strangled by drawing his knees up from the floor. End quote. They also found the negative of a photograph positioned where he could see it. The negative showed Fry naked with, quote, ropes trussed around his ankles, knees, and thighs, tape over his mouth and eyes, and a hangman's noose around his neck, end quote. The darkroom contained another picture clipped from a magazine, and it was probably one of these two. Next slide, please. These are pictures of Elizabeth Bergner, who was playing the title role in The Duchess of Malfi, a 17th century revenge tragedy. In this scene, she is about to be executed by strangulation, and you'll see there's an executioner on each side of her, and each one is holding a rope around her neck. So presumably when the execution is done by the men standing opposite pulling the rope. Now, the judging by, she's about to be executed by strangulation, and judging by Fry's position, and how the ligatures were arranged, this picture apparently inspired what deputy sheriffs called the strangest suicide in Southern California records. Mrs. Fry said she never saw any of the pictures and could not guess why her husband killed himself. There is no mention of a suicide note, no changes in behavior or mood, and judging by the description, Fry didn't kill himself, but he died accidentally while engaged in autoerotic asphyxia. Like Michael Hutchins, Fry was nude, and while this is not proof of autoerotic asphyxiation, a Canadian study found that, quote, if one classifies all cases where the corpse was nude, cross-dressed, or found with the genitals exposed or accessible, if you classify them as autoerotic accidents, and you classify all the other subjects, which is death by asphyxiation, as suicides, then one would correctly predict the coroner's verdict in all but 14 of the 235 cases with information. So, again, the body is nude, cross-dressed, or found with the genitals exposed or accessible. It doesn't prove autoerotic asphyxiation, but it is consistent with the coroner's verdict in all but 14 of 235 cases. In at least one historical case, though, nudity was actually considered evidence for suicide. When a 17-year-old boy was found hanged naked in 1888, it was decided that, quote, the dead boy must have been temporarily insane when he killed himself. The fact that the body was naked goes towards confirming this theory, end quote. As for pornography, it is often used in autoerotic asphyxia, and for Fry, pornography meant pictures depicting torture. Although I suspect that what the reporter calls torture, we would probably call bondage. He also took a photograph of himself in bondage and looked at the negative while asphyxiating himself. So, by doing that, he actually combines two elements that are often seen in autoerotic asphyxia: homemade erotica and the desire to see himself engaged in the act. Fry presumably found the picture of the Duchess of Malfi exciting enough to create a similar situation for himself, all of which suggests an elaborate sadomasochistic fantasy, perhaps even a fantasy about being executed rather than suicide. Fry's case, also like many others, involves fetishes. Could I have the next slide, please? And these are inanimate objects that people find sexually exciting. Fetishes like chains, leather, sex toys, rubber, those are common fetishes. But again, a fetish can even be a slice of mandarin orange, it was for Milligan. And these fetishes can be incorporated into autoerotic asphyxia. But of all of them, of all of these fetishes, cross dressing is probably the most troublesome. For those who were unaware at the time of autoerotic asphyxia's existence, cross dressing can make deciding whether death was a result of suicide or murder especially difficult. And this was certainly true in the case of John William Lemke. Could I have the next slide, please? Among the older examples of autoerotic asphyxiation that I've found, Lemke's death might have received the most extensive newspaper coverage. He was 21 years old, came from a wealthy family in the Flushing section of Queens in New York City, and on October 1919, his body was found on board the family's yacht, which was anchored in Flushing Bay. And this chart shows where his body where it was found in the yacht's hold. Lemke's body lay on the floor of the cabin with a hood over his head. The hood was held in place by a rope, one end of which was knotted around the noose, was one end of the rope rather was made into a noose, was knotted into a noose, and that was around his neck, while the other end had apparently slipped from some point to which it had been attached. A strong cord was around Lemke's hands and knees, but what he wore was especially baffling. Could I have the next slide, please? This is not a very clear picture, but this shows what he was wearing. It consisted of a pair of black mercerized stockings, a house gown of gingham, an undershirt, a pair of bloomers, a corset, and corset cover, and long garters. The shoes were women's lace shoes, and on a seat in the forward cabin was another pair of women's stockings and a pair of women's black dancing pumps. End quote. For those who knew John Lemke, though, none of this made sense. The family insisted that he was perfectly normal, had an unusually cheerful nature, and no reason to kill himself. Furthermore, the victim's uncle said about the garments that, well, the garments that he was wearing were cheap, filthy, and sweat-stained. And according to the uncle, that was a condition that would have been repugnant to John Lemke, for, quote, the boy was unusually cleanly in his personal habits, end quote. Furthermore, these cross-dressing had unsettling implications at the time because it was almost synonymous with homosexuality. Next slide, please. Now, this is a picture of, I believe this picture was taken at one of New York City's drag balls. I'm not positive about that, but I believe that's where it was taken. Now, the image and definition of homosexuality have changed over time. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, however, the, quote, fairy was the prevailing stereotype. So the Lemke family and their friends made sure that reporters knew that John was, quote, every inch a healthy masculine type of boy, and never did he show a sign or indication of effeminacy, closed quote. And next slide, please. They presumably provided these pictures of John Lemke looking especially heterosexual. And when it came to the clothing found on John's body, his uncle added that, quote, I remember well that about 2 years ago, when there were preparations for a masquerade, John was asked if he would put on women's clothes, but he said he would by no means do it. There was nothing ladylike about him. He delighted to show his masculinity, and he could fight. End quote. For those who knew him then, murder became the most reasonable explanation for his death. Meanwhile, the police and chief medical examiner had a different problem. They could not explain the clothing, nor could they find a motive for why he might have killed himself, and there was no evidence for murder. All the chief medical examiner could come up with was that the young man had a hidden mental quirk that was only revealed in his bizarre suicide. The controversy, however, about his death went on for months. Newspapers were actually printing lists of reasons for believing why Lemke was murdered, along with lists of reasons for believing why he might have killed himself. But on December 11, 1919, an official conclusion was reached. According to those who did the investigation, John W. Lemke died of either murder or suicide. No one knew which. It was a frustrating but honest verdict, and the kind that might be expected from an autoerotic asphyxiation fatality. Now, before moving on, I'd like to say one more thing about Albert Rudisell, the man mentioned at the beginning with the black dress and the goggles. The official cause of death for him is murder. Specifically on his death certificate, it says murder strangulation. What makes his case especially unusual is that 3 years later, a woman named May Garland confessed to killing him. Could I have the next slide? That's May Garland. According to Garland, she beat Rudisell to death with a broken brick. She hanged him in the warehouse, and then she left to get clothing. When she returned, she dressed him in her evening gown and earrings and hauled the corpse back up. But police were not convinced. In fact, Garland later admitted that she made up the story, saying that she had been depressed and was hoping to be executed. So it was a case of false confession. Apparently, she had also been in jail when the death occurred, and she might have heard rumors about it from either police or other inmates. Anyway, despite this tendency for autoerotic asphyxiation fatalities to resemble murder and suicide, they were also explained as accidents, or more accurately, as accidents that occurred during some non-sexual activity. And that is how John G. Schramm of St. Joseph, Michigan is supposed to have died. Next slide, please. Schramm was 38 years old and a prominent local doctor who was active in sports, and he was married to the Michigan Blossom Queen of 1930. So, in other words, very respectable, very much a pillar of the community type. And when he was found dead in his office on September 9, 1941, a newspaper called it the strangest and most mysterious death case in Berrien County in the last decade. Now, the doctor lay face down on a table in the x-ray room with a blanket underneath him. There was a spray tube of ethyl chloride held in his right hand near his nose, and 2 diathermy pads strapped to his naked body, and these pads had been secured with sash rope. One pad was attached to the back of Schramm's torso, and the other to his front, and the one on his front had burned a small hole into his body. The pads were not connected to the diathermy machine, which was in another room. Now, ethyl chloride is a topical anesthetic used for minor surgical procedures, while diathermy is a form of physical therapy in which electromagnetic currents are used to create heat within the body. When it's used incorrectly or with worn-out equipment, however, it can also produce electric shocks and burns like they found on Schramm's body. Now, in addition, the X-ray room also contained a long, narrow mirror that had apparently been placed so that Dr. Schramm could watch himself. A length of rope had also been fashioned into a loop and attached over the office door, with the far end presumably tied to the knob on the other side. Dr. Schramm's office assistant said the mirror did not belong where it was found, and the rope had not been there when she left work. According to his death certificate, which you can see next to his picture, the immediate cause of death was asphyxia from accidental inhalation of ethyl chloride, but that did little to explain the odd situation. Next picture, please. Now, that is a tube of ethyl chloride. That might very well be the same kind that he was using at the time, because this example is from the 1940s. Now, it was suggested, the first idea was that Dr. Schramm had died while he was performing some strange experiment on himself. As one newspaper pointed out, the fact that, quote, Schramm had divested himself of his clothing was pointed out as supporting the experimental idea for why, if suicide was intended, would the victim strip himself of his clothes? And if he was murdered, why would his assailant or assailants disrobe their victim? End quote. Oh, sorry about that. Being nude, however, is easier to explain than wearing women's lingerie. So it was also stated that Dr. Schramm used diathermy to treat himself for poor circulation. And that apparently became the basis for the official verdict. It was decided that he, quote, was probably taking or giving himself a diathermy, and while the current was on, something happened that he received a burn. This undoubtedly caused him to have considerable pain, and he might have resorted to ethyl chloride inhalation for relief. Ethyl chloride, being a very rapid anesthetic, might overcome his consciousness, and he fell unconscious over the x-ray table, still grasping the ethyl chloride tube, as the tube was found by the officers to still have gas in it and flowing freely. This led to death by asphyxia, end quote. Another possibility, however, is that Dr. Schramm was using volatile chemicals instead of a ligature and died accidentally during autoerotic asphyxia. Ethyl chloride causes dizziness, euphoria, and confusion, and according to one source, Schramm had placed the blanket that he was supposedly lying on over his head, presumably to concentrate the fumes, and that had proved fatal. As for the mirror, many people are aroused by the sight of themselves performing autoerotic asphyxia, and though the rope's purpose is unknown, its presence suggests bondage. And then there are the diathermy pads and the burn on his body. Next slide, please. This is a small home model of a diathermy machine. I don't know what kind of model he had in his office, but this shows the kind of electrodes that might have been attached to his body. Now, Dr. Schramm owned two diathermy machines, a new one and an old one, and that had been the one he was hooked up to. Now, this is pure speculation, but autoerotic asphyxia sometimes includes torture with electricity. So it is possible that he was using the old machine to jolt himself with electric shocks, which resulted in a burn. According to the current classification of autoerotic asphyxiation, the use of electricity means Dr. Schramm's death would be classified as an atypical autoerotic death. Now, there are many more examples of possible autoerotic asphyxiation fatalities. Next slide, please. As you can see, I have binders filled with newspaper clippings containing probable examples of autoerotic asphyxiation and explanations for them. And these explanations might be obsolete now, but they offer a fascinating perspective on the recent past. And yet it also raises a question of why talk about incorrect explanations for a dangerous form of sadomasochism that, if it's not exactly understood, no longer creates unnecessary mysteries when someone dies from it. And the reason for that is that The Strange But True offers a unique perspective on history and culture. In the case of autoerotic asphyxiation, reading the old accounts can be frustrating. You might be tempted to grab the doctor or detective being quoted by his lapels and yelling, "How obtuse can you be? This is obviously about sex." In fact, I have two old accounts in which doctors discuss autoerotic asphyxiation deaths as suicides that took a sexual form. And the 1956 book Transvestism asks a question that at least puts it in a sexual context. It refers to a case from 1929. It says, in 1929, Mrs. Frances Piper discovered the body of her 16-year-old son, Arthur, fully clothed in her apparel, hanging in the kitchen. It asks, what strange quirk caused the boy to take his own life? Was he seeking a release from a life which he knew denied him the opportunity of wearing the finery he had donned for his last moments? So, for an author of a book on transvestism, autoerotic asphyxiation can be explained as suicide because he believed he would never be able to wear the clothing he loved. Contemporary newspapers actually suggested that Arthur died while playing a prank, and you'd be surprised at some of the deaths that get explained as someone playing a prank. Anyway, I do not believe that the professionals, the people, the police, and the doctors, I do not believe that they actually knew what was happening and were providing sanitized explanations for public consumption. I believe that they did not know that this was sexual in nature. And some evidence for that is that when autoerotic asphyxiation occurs in places where the practice is little known today, the same arguments appear about whether it was murder or suicide, and cross-dressing is just as confusing. These cases also have interesting regional qualities, like the death of India's most famous paranormal investigator, Gaurav Tiwari. Next picture, please. Now, the 31-year-old Tiwari died of strangulation in 2016 under circumstances that suggest autoerotic asphyxiation. His death is officially suicide, and there are vague suspicions that his family killed him. In fact, they discovered his body, and they might have found something embarrassing at the scene. Even today, and certainly over in history, historically, family members will clean up the scene of an autoerotic asphyxiation death. They'll hide the pornography, they'll strip the body of fetish clothing, and then they'll lie to the police about it. And I actually suspect that that's what happened in Tiwari's case, and that the reason the police were a bit suspicious of them was they didn't get their stories quite straight. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but you can look him up online. It's actually very interesting. The family denied, for example, that finding any kind of cord around his neck when you can see there's actually a photograph taken of him on the morgue table, and there's quite obviously a ligature mark around his throat. And they also said that they did not see that mark when they found his body. But anyway, it was his association with the paranormal that led many to believe that evil spirits had either killed him or they drove him to suicide. And there is another notorious case, this one's from China, called The Boy in the Red Dress. Next slide, please. Now, in 2009, the body of 13-year-old Kwang Ji-jun was found hanging in his family's old farmhouse. He wore a red dress, a girl's swimsuit that had been padded to look like he had breasts, and the body was found with elaborate knots, and it was bound rather in elaborate knots, and there was a weight tied to his feet. Now, this sounds like a textbook case of autoerotic asphyxiation, but local police decided that Kwang died as a result of an accident that occurred while he was playing a, quote, superstitious game. Others have suggested that he was killed as part of a Taoist magical ritual, and while that's an interesting story, and we only have so much time, so let's move to the conclusion. I'm actually not going to close with something about autoerotic asphyxiation deaths. I'm going to close with a personal message that is related to them, though. I am a Fortean, and I love what Forteans love. As a child, I memorized Bernard Hugelmann's sea serpent classification system. Richard Freeman taught me the correct way to pronounce Mongolian deathworm in Mongolian. And I've been in auditoriums filled with alien abductees. I've spent the night in a haunted cave that was under a haunted museum and built on a haunted battlefield. And I've even seen one or two things that I can't, to be honest, explain. But despite all that, my interest always returns to our unparanormal fellow men. And autoerotic asphyxiation reminds me why. It's a reminder that an occasional cloudburst of frogs can't compare with what Homo sapiens get up to. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Robert. Very different talk, very interesting one. A subject that even now I suspect the majority of us know very little about. And, you know, we've seen there how an unexplained phenomena is explained away by people as time goes by and as more knowledge comes about, different explanations um, are put forward. So it's very much a Fortean roundup of how things have changed over the years. Um,
Yes, it's also got kind of a hard lesson in there for Forteans in that you can get every observation correct. You can get you can do all your interviews. You can learn everything you can learn and still come to an absolutely wrong conclusion because you don't understand the true nature of what's happening. You'll get some of the external manifestations correct, but if you don't understand the true nature of what happened, which in this case is a sexual act, it's baffling. It's utterly baffling, and it does not fit into how we understand the world.
very sage words there, very sage. If I could make a couple of points, the the famous ones, the Stephen Milligan, the Michael Hutchins, and David Carradine, they're cases that I can generally remember from from when they happened, etc., etc. And with Stephen Milligan, I have heard that he basically made a mistake and he used an orange in his mouth. I have heard that in autoerotic asphyxiation, some people use a lemon, with the
Oh,
idea being that as they pass out, as they become unconscious, they bite down on the lemon, and the acidity of the lemon juice is a sharp shock to them, which snaps them back into consciousness so they can rescue themselves from that situation.
oh, that's fascinating, Gordon. I actually never heard of that. As for all the reading I've done, I never heard that one. Um, I do know that one of the really interesting things about this, I'm sorry, I tend to get caught up in the minutia of these cases, is the escape mechanisms that are created because it's not like the people doing this, most of them anyway, they don't want to die. This is pleasure for them. It can be a very strange form of pleasure, and sometimes it can be very painful. Certainly to someone, to someone who doesn't share their tastes. But I have there are some fascinating escape mechanisms. There was one case from California where this young man, he was an engineering student, and he had hanged himself. He was wearing he was wearing a two-piece women's bikini. He was wrapped in chains. He that were held with a padlock. He had locked all the doors, drawn all the curtains, and he had set up an escape mechanism for himself that involved a burning candle that would eventually release a key into his hand that would allow him to open the locks and escape. But something went wrong, and he hanged himself. This was actually, I think, as late as the late 1950s, and all that the newspapers could come up with was that it was a prank that went wrong. And all I could think was, if you read the whole description of what he'd been doing, as I was thinking to myself, that is really a lot of commitment to a prank.
That reminds me of a film starring Richard Harris, and the very first thing that happens in the film is the patriarch of the family engages in autoerotic asphyxiation, and
The
he,
ruling class.
the ruling class, that's it. And doesn't he have a candle to burn through the rope, but the candle falls over? Or am I
I don't,
misremembering that?
I don't remember the candle. I do remember that what he was doing was he was standing on top of one of those. I believe he was standing on top of one of those little rolling ladders that are used in libraries. And after he put on his tutu, he would launch from it and swing around the room a little bit, swing around a little bit, and then he lost his footing and he wasn't able to, and that's how he choked. Also, his servant, I think his servant left for some reason, and I think his servant was supposed to act as a spotter.
Yeah, it's an excellent film. It's a long time since
Oh,
I've seen
well,
it.
it wasn't Richard Harris, it was Peter O'Toole.
Peter O'Toole, thank you. My
Right.
apologies. Yeah, very
No.
similar actors. Very similar actors.
Mm-hmm.
Um, another. This is more a point than a question.
Mm-hmm.
When you showed the series of fetish pictures, in the bottom right-hand corner of that, there was a cartoon from some sort of book or something. And I don't know if I'm possibly setting myself up here, but I recognise that illustration,
Yes.
and it's by, I can't remember. You can remind me. I'm sure it's by Jerry Siegel or Joe Shuster, whichever one
It
did
was
the.
Joel. It was Joel Shuster. When Joel Shuster, when when superhero comic book work got a little thin, he would illustrate. He would do naughty, erotic illustrations. That's actually that's why I roughed it up a little bit because it looked. I find his erotic illustrations just plain comical. I mean, it looks like Superman is getting whipped
By Lois Lane, no
by
less.
Lois Lane. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah. So, Robert,
Yes.
again, thank you very much for an excellent and illuminating talk. Do you know how common the practice is? Because I mean, obviously,
I don't think anyone knows.
no.
Judging by the papers I've read, the internet, of course, has made research a lot easier because it used to be that the only cases of autoerotic asphyxiation that could be investigated were the fatalities. But now, because of the internet, it's possible to get in contact with people that practice it while they're still alive and talk to them about their fantasies, their interests. From the little I've read about it, because obviously I was concentrating on a different an aspect of the story, but from the little I've read about it, the people who practice it consider it very superior to ordinary sex. And that's why it's very difficult to get them to stop. This is their sex life, and they genuinely enjoy it. What I find so fascinating is with these old cases where individuals managed to figure it out for themselves and developed these complicated fetishes that are almost exactly like the ones that exist today. I just find that fascinating. I suppose that back when hanging was a common form of execution, you would get young people and children that would play at hanging, the same way that Victorian children used to play at funeral and used to play at deathbed and used to play at church. So I'm sure they used to play at execution too. And I suspect that they might have discovered what being strangled felt like that way. Maybe they played something similar to not the knockout, the pass out game, which school children still do, where they will hold their breath until they pass out, or they will strangle themselves till they pass out. And some of them enjoyed it and built on that. That's as nearly as I can figure it out. I mean, in the case of the man Vernal Fry, he found that picture almost certainly in Life magazine, I think it was. Now, for anyone else looking at that, it's wow, what a dramatic picture from the Duchess of Malfi. But for him, it was pornography. It was sexually exciting, and he actually based something he was doing on that picture. And like I said, this is not ghosts, this is not flying saucers, but I think it's at least as interesting.
Definitely, it's a fascinating subject. Fascinating. Do you think we have to finish with the warning of don't try this at home?
Oh yeah, I suppose I always forget to be responsible. Yeah, don't do this. It's genuinely dangerous. It takes the slightest thing that goes wrong can not only result in asphyxiation, but it can cause, I think, what's called a vasovagal. Anyway, there's a vagal nerve in the neck, and if it is activated somehow, it can cause the heart to stop. So don't do this.
Cool. On that note, thank you
Uh,
very much, Robert. And I'll just quickly remind everyone of what's happening next month. So, next month we're moving on to November, of course, and our meeting will be on the second Tuesday of November, and that's the 10th of November. And we'll be having John Tantalon talking to us. And the title of his talk is From the Dark, Wardy Steps to the Ominous Tally Tour, North Edinburgh Nightmares. And I'll just read a little description of what he's sent along as to what he's going to be talking about. What's at the bottom of Wardy Steps? Was the question my grandfather asked me all those years ago. He was a man with a lifetime of experience at sea, who acquired the rank of Chief Petty Officer and would later sail on countless vessels in Scottish waters and afar. During his years, my grandfather relayed many tales of local history to me and many ghost stories. It was here that my curiosity began. The tale of a trawlerman terrorised on board a cursed voyage only to appear face to face with a ghostly nautical apparition scared me no end. After hearing the frightening tale of Slangevar, I remained hooked. My passion for ghost stories commenced at a young age. I discovered many terrifying tales from the boundaries of North Edinburgh. Now, so shall you. Hear the tale of a phantom security guard who haunts the barren landscape of Leith Docks. Listen to a terrifying recollection from an ex-employee of the ominous Craig Crook Castle. Discover the alarming tale of a mysterious bed inside a Granton property and the recently deceased owner who returned to claim his prized possession. I will relay these stories and many more. North Edinburgh Nightmares. And that's on Tuesday, the 10th of November. Thank you again, Robert. Thank you, everyone, for watching, and see you all soon.